that. By the end of 1848, pretty well everything is gone in Europe, the counter-revolution. And Canada held on until April 49, and then you have an attempted counter-coup. Everybody who went into the streets to try and to burn the Parliament buildings and to bring down the government knew that all through Europe, the democratic governments had been overthrown. They knew that. The newspapers were filled with that. And they had daily information. What's never mentioned is that the telegraph system was working in Toronto and Montreal, New York, Europe. We were getting information, within a week of what was going on in Europe. So everybody knew that the democratic movement had been defeated. And so the elite and the Orange Order went into the streets. They burnt down the Parliament buildings. And it's just fascinating. You just track LaFontaine and Baldwin's response to this classic attempt at a counter-coup. They had the troops to bring out. They had enough British troops to bring out that could have just, they just line up the troops and open fire and it's over. That's what empires are all about is, you got just enough troops to open fire in an orderly manner and the mob goes away, leaving some dead behind. And it isn't about whether they're your cousins or not in the street. That's what troops do in empires. And they didn't do that. They held cabinet meetings in which they consciously put on record in the cabinet meetings that they would not use the troops because it was not appropriate. And they actually invented lines about using restraint, about not using violence, about finding other ways to govern which were not violent. They invented the idea of restraint. I mean, Lester Pearson's peacekeeping, you can trace it back in some ways to Aboriginal approaches, and you can trace it back in some ways to those days in 1849. It's absolutely astonishing. And then there's this day when the Parliament meets temporarily in the Bon Secours Market upstairs in the West Ballroom, which is still there. And they write an address to the Governor-General saying, "You are so wonderful. And please come to town," because he lived outside of town, "and we will tell you how wonderful you are." It's read an address to the Governor-General. Of course, what they were really saying is, we're wonderful. That's what you use the Governor-General for. It's a mirror, right? And so he came to town on a Monday morning, or Monday afternoon, and everybody thought everything was under control. And the mob had taken over the streets of Montreal. There was something like 5,000, a mob of 5,000. They'd completely surrounded the government headquarters, which was the Chateau Ramsay, which still exists just across from the City Hall. And the government of Canada was besieged by this mob. And the Governor-General, unknowing, with 12 uncertain amateur cavalrymen to protect him, in the state coach, came down Notre Dame? I guess it's Notre Dame. Is it Notre Dame? I'm trying to remember now. I'm looking over at the expert here. And of course, you're coming down this street and you don't know whether the mob's on your side or against you till you get close to it and you can't turn around. You've got all these horses and a state coach, And literally, he was surrounded by this mob. He was stoned, heavily stoned. The mob they broke in the coach. Anyway, they managed to get through at the last minute. And all of this is happening, and the government is deciding not to open fire, not to use violence, because they knew that if they used violence, we'd be turned into a place like Ireland. It was really as simple as that. And that idea, the invention of the idea of government through restraint, we owe in large part to LaFontaine and Baldwin. And the absence of violence in our history ever since then. And you look at a government and say, oh, they used violence, bad mark, sort of thing. We owe all of that to LaFontaine and Baldwin. It's very, very interesting the originality, the intentionality of it all is what's so interesting. And when you look at Riel and Jumont, it's intentional what they were doing. Even if they were defeated, it was not by accident. It was intentional.
Well, Riel went to his death because he would not allow his own defense to say that he was insane. Exactly. Because he realized that if they paint me as insane and I am released, or not released, but put into an institution again, the Métis cause is going to be judged as insane. So he fought his own defense in order to try to prove that he wasn't insane, and it's the same.
Exactly, it's the intentionality of it, which is
that,
and that's a form of courage and of enormous intellectual strength.